world there on my land. We're going to bring in.
Yeah, I think it sounds very much.
So I'm just gonna check in for folks, as far as the like I said, we have Todd scheduled as a tag. And so our folks in online land are still having some technical difficulties, so please bear with us and we'll be with you. So we're a little bit stable, so why don't we just break.
Can you hear me? Mine's on. Yeah? Can you hear me? Off? Oh, it's red.
Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Can anyone hear this? They said much better. Can hear now. They can all hear it. Can we hear with this one as well?
It's just, you know why? It's competing. No, try to do it on the go-to because I have it up, so we want to see them in the beginning.
All right. What's supposed to They can see it. You're right. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I know.
Even my webcam is for on go-to. It's not showing up.
All right. And Todd got all dressed up.
I know.
But people can see me here in the room. So.
That's true.
I feel really bad, but I don't even know. Like we're trying to fix.
Emily, I am going to unmute you, and can you speak so that we can make sure that we can hear everyone? Give me 1 second. All right, Emily, can you speak?
Hi, Anissa. We can hear you.
Oh, okay. So the speakers work. All right. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. So we're gonna have the remote sites introduce themselves. So I will call. Just say hi. We don't need full introductions, but we will start that in about 2 minutes once Lisa kind of introduces everything else. So I will unmute you as I call your remote site. And then I need to know what the remote site is. So it's going to be San Diego, Atascadero, and
Okay. Okay.
then just hand me the microphone back.
All right, I'll stand right here and do it. Okay. I'm ready to go. All right. Okay. We're going to call everybody together. We're going to restart or reboot. And I know some extra folks have come into the room, so welcome to all of you that have arrived. And right now we're prepared to have our online audience introduce themselves to you. You won't see them like we had hoped, but we can hear them. So from San Diego, we'll have Emily Sulpicio introduce herself. And how many people are in your group?
Give me 1 second. Let me unmute you, Emily. All right, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. This is Emily Sulpicio. We're in San Diego, and we have 5 participants here today.
Great, thank you. We're going to move to Atascadero with Gwendolyn. Give me 1 second. Let me unmute you so that you can introduce yourself, Gwendolyn. All right, go ahead.
Hi, this is Gwendolyn, and we have 3 participants, 4 including myself, here in Atascadero.
All right, thank you, Gwendolyn. We are excited that you are all joining us today. Now we're going to move to Lancaster with Esther. And I don't see Esther here. It might be Victor. Give me 1 second. All right, Victor Gonzalez, are you from Lancaster? He is, because I know him, but we can't hear him, so we're going to have to move on.
Victor says hello.
And then from San Bernardino, we're going to introduce Stacy. So let me unmute you. Go ahead, Stacy.
Good morning, everyone. This is Stacy. We have 3 people here today. Hi.
And where are you guys coming from?
San Bernardino.
The first 5 office? Hello?
Can you hear us okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you tell us a little bit about where you are from, San Bernardino? What office are you from?
We're at First 5 San Bernardino.
First 5 San Bernardino. All right, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to pass the mic back to Lisa.
So besides our remote audience in those communities, we have a great number of folks who are sitting in their own offices right now, and welcome to all of you. And so we're ready to start our program. And this is number 3 of our Learning Community series that we about a year ago said we're going to focus on data and how it influences our work in family strengthening programs. Today it's on staff and volunteer is our focus. And I'd like to introduce Todd Sosna from the self, but also right now with Children's Institute. And he'll be introducing our today. And thank you, Todd. And this has been a great journey because he's been with us from the very beginning of this process. And here you go.
Which mic, you guys? On? Good, you guys? All right, good morning. So it's great to be here. Some people I recognize from when we were in the endowment a few months back. So I'm going to give a little overview about the focus that we've been having in the convenings. This is the third of a 4-part series. So I'm going to give you an overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about the first and the second convening, and then we're going to focus on the main presentation. All right? Okay. So this is a 4-part series, and the overall purpose of the series was to help agencies strengthen their capacity to do evaluation. And the idea was we were going to help develop a culture of inquiry. And by that we meant that your organizations would, 1, value data, 2, you would be relentless in gathering data. And I say that because often we have the intention to do evaluation, but we never quite get around to collecting the data. We talk about collecting data and we have measures, but we never actually collect it. If we do collect it, sometimes it's a little sparse. So I say relentless. Like we really, an agency with a culture of inquiry is really interested in how they're doing. And part of that is intentional and purposeful about collecting data so that they have something they can say. And if it's too sketchy or too spotty, then it makes it hard to be able to, to make use of it and for it to be credible. To share data and reports, sometimes we collect data, but we never share it. If we don't share it, then it's like, it doesn't matter that we collected it, no one knows. And part of a culture of inquiry is that you're going to talk about data, which means you have to share what you have, even if it's sketchy, even if it's spotty, so that people can begin to have a conversation about what are we doing and how is it working. And then we talked about having it be practical and relevant. Sometimes we have very elaborate ideas about how to collect data, but the expansiveness of that idea can become a barrier to actually doing it. So we talk about keeping it practical. Basic information about who we're serving, what we're doing, what we're delivering in the way of services, and something about a primary outcome. What kind of effect did we have? So that was the idea, that we were going to really focus on a culture of inquiry. We talked a little bit about tailoring our evaluation to our audience. Different audiences are interested in different kinds of outcomes. And this 4-part series is organized around audiences, which I'll talk about in terms of the first and the second convening. We focused on different audiences. Outcome data usually used for one of 2 major reasons. One is accountability, so that you could show what you've done. This is typically the requirement or an expectation of a funder. But the other is to help inform a decision. In order to make the evaluation useful, one wants to think about who is the decision maker and what is the decision you're trying to influence. And then that gives you an idea about the kind of outcome data you want to collect. We collect all kinds of information about who we serve, what we give them, and how they end up working. But in order to be useful, in order for it to have practical utility, we have to be thinking about what decision are we trying to inform with the data. So it's not data for data's sake, but data for decision making to help us make better decisions. Funders make decisions, staff make decisions, managers of agencies make decisions, policymakers make decisions, clients make decisions about a variety of things. And so, excuse me, I'm both throat lozengeing because I'm getting over a cold, so it's keeping me from coughing, but it's not entirely working. So the point is, when we think about what decision we want to make and who the decision maker is, helps us decide what outcomes or what information we have would be useful for that purpose. So that outcome evaluation isn't done in isolation, it's done in the context of what decisions we're trying to inform. So that was the overall premise for this 4-part series. In the first convening, we focused on funders and what funders would be interested in, which is usually accountability. You've been received funding to serve a certain population, to provide a certain kind of service, to advance a certain kind of outcome, and they want some indication that was achieved. So that's the funder's perspective. And a lot of the data we collect is funder-driven, typically. We also shared some examples of reports. We talked about different methods that could be quantitative or it could be qualitative and how that could be done. All of this information, by the way, is available by Strategies, and they can send you the previous PowerPoints and webinars. You can see the presentations, and you can follow along if you missed those. And we wanted to really advance the organizational culture, so we had sort of homework, like things people would do. So there were 4 things. We said start a first-level outcome report, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We said create a data information table. That was simply a table that showed all the different data, all the different information you already collect. When a client enrolls, and something about your client, and when you deliver services, all the stuff that's already routinely done, just to give you an idea of what was available without adding anything new. We said convene a discussion about your primary impact so we could begin to think about outcomes. And we said convene a conversation with your staff so that you could begin to have this culture of inquiry. In the second convening, we focused on policymakers. What kinds of information are they interested in? They're often interested in unmet needs and the way in which our services meet those needs. We talked about additional approaches to analysis and reporting. We heard a really good presentation from Jolie Mason, who had attended the previous convening, and she had talked about how she went about creating a workbook that walked through all the steps of creating a practical evaluation. We also heard a presentation from Cheryl Wold about the Portrait of America and the Human Development Index. And this was an example of how we can use third-party data that's available and that's specific to your communities. So information about how people are doing by zip code or by neighborhood that you could use as a benchmark for your own effectiveness. And then we talked about, in terms of next steps, identifying an outcome measure, which tends to be the more complicated thing. We all have data on who we serve, we all have data on what we do, but we all don't have agreement on how we're going to measure outcomes. So we said pick one measure, don't have to pick a lot of measures, better to start somewhere than to not start at all. And then we said create a second generation report, a second level report, which was the first level report plus an outcome measure, which I'll come to in a moment. And we said continue the conversations that you had started with your staff about use of data. So when we talked about outcomes reports, we talked about keeping them simple and straightforward. They don't need to be complicated. You don't need an elaborate database. You don't need to have something, really complicated. We said share the information and think about what the audience is going to be. We talked about 4 kinds of information: a very simple report, a page or 2 long. The first part of the report is about who you serve. The second part of the report is about what services they received. The third part of the report is about a single outcome measure, about how some aspect of what they were wanting to achieve improved. And then a little description about how you put that all together. That would be your outcome report, 2 pages long. We said, consider collecting 10 pieces of information and think about how many of these you already have available to you. The date of the referral. This is the date someone approached your agency or your program and asked for services. This is the date you received a referral. The first date they received your service. The last date they received your service. And the number of times you saw them. And then whether or not they completed, yes they completed or no they ended early, how old they were, their gender, their ethnicity, the primary reason they came to you, so what were they seeking, and one outcome measure, like a protective factors measures or a parenting measures or one measure of change. 10 pieces of information. And that would make your first and your second level report. Probably you already have these 10 pieces of information because whoever funds you probably expects this information. So you would go to this information and you could do any of these things in your report. You could identify entry rate. That's the percentage of people who seek services who start. Referral date, first session. You want as many people who seek to start, so you want that to be a high number. 9 out of every 10 people who are referred to us actually start the first contact. You could do completion rate. How many of those who start complete? Because you have a start date and you have a field that says, did they complete? Average age, that's their ages averaged. Their gender and their ethnicity, how many are men, how many are women, what is the ethnic distribution, and how many came with what primary concern. So you could talk about who you're serving, what their needs were. Activities provided, how many times you saw them, and how long those lasted. 10 one-hour parenting classes, 2 financial assistance classes, right? So you could describe the level of service, all with the same 10 pieces of information. And then you could say how they improved. Improvement in parenting, improvement in protective factors, improvement in savings, improvement in financial literacy, improvement in whatever single outcome measure you had intended to change. And then you could do something really interesting. You could look at the entry rate and the completion rate, the level of service and the outcomes, and look at it by gender or ethnicity to be able to say something like the percentage of people who enter, the percentage of people who complete, the percentage of services they get, how well they do, does or doesn't vary by ethnicity, right? Or by income, or by gender, all with the same 10 pieces of information. So we said, consider taking one program, consider looking at those 10 pieces of information, and consider doing an initial report. And then sharing that report and having a conversation so that you could begin to create this culture of inquiry. So that's what we covered in the first 2 convenings. And all of that information is available. You can see the whole webinars. You could skip ahead to the over the boring bits and go to the really exciting bits. You could see Jolie, you could see Cheryl, you could hear all of the more detailed information. That's sort of the synopsis. Okay? So what are we doing today? This being the 3rd convening in this series. So today the audience that we're focusing on, the first time we focused on funders, the second time we focused on policymakers. Today we're focusing on staff. And we say volunteers because a lot of our agencies use volunteers like staff. So like the volunteers are doing things for us, but we're not paying them, but because they're volunteers. Otherwise, we would call them staff if we were paying them, I guess. But the idea is the people who provide the services, that's the audience. So what do people who provide services, how could they use outcome information? How could they use data? And we're talking about it in the context of a culture of inquiry. And so one of the ways staff can use data is in their work with individual participants. So if you have information about participants and you share that information with them, that's one way the staff can use it. If you don't have any sort of outcome data, then your conversation with your participants is not informed by your work. So imagine you could say to somebody, 9 out of 10 people who start our parenting class finish it. And 9 out of the 10 who finish it show a 50% improvement in parenting skills. And rate our classes as highly satisfying. Then if I'm a participant thinking about joining a parenting class, that gives me information and hopefulness and confidence about what I'm going to get if I participate. Right? Or maybe you have an outcome measure about protective factors and you give it to them as a baseline measure. Then you can share the scores with them. You ever go to the doctor and they take your temperature and your blood pressure? Even if you're there for a foot ache or something? I don't know why they always do it. But don't you always ask them what it is? Even though you know you don't have a fever, don't you say, by the way, what's my temperature? Because they took it. Don't you want to know? So if you're gathering information from somebody, then we should sit with them and we should say, we did this protective factors and this is the result of this. This is what we found out. And by the way, this is how you compare to the normative sample. You're higher, you're lower, right? Because, and that will begin to be used in your services. And you're going to give it later and talk about change, right? Which is very reinforcing. Your blood pressure's high, you go in, the doctor gives you something, you go back the next time, they take your blood pressure again, it's lower. You feel better because you know how things are changing. You don't just go get your blood pressure, take medicine, take your blood pressure, and they never tell you. It's a mystery. Only I know how you're doing, right? You wouldn't do that. So this is the idea of using it with participants. You can use it with staff so they can know how they're doing. Are we having success? Do I, help me feel better, build morale about all the work we're doing? Because people come into my program and people leave my program. They come in needing help. They leave presumably feeling better. But wouldn't it be nice to know that, so that I get a sense of how I'm doing? And we could also use it for improvement. We could stop and reflect. We always want the data to reflect that we're doing well, but there may also be opportunities for improvement. Are we open to that? To not getting quite the outcomes we want. So 8 out of 10 people improve. What about the 2 out of 10 people who don't improve? Are they the same or different than the 8 who did improve? What could we do to get 9 out of 10 to improve, right? So we could use it in our services with participants. We could use it to help our staff understand the benefit of their own work, and we can use it for quality improvement. So data when staff is your audience is the focus for today's presentation. So with that, I am going to double check my time. I'm actually kind of I'm good on time. Usually I drag. I don't know how that happened. So for today, 2 things. We're going to hear a presentation. I'm going to introduce our main presenter in a moment. But I'm going to also talk about what we would like to do. And I don't know how many organizations have done this, or the folks who are joining remotely. But in the 4th convening, which is coming, which will be the last in the series, it would be great to be able to share some samples. So the hope is that some of our organizations, that some of you in the room and some of you joining remotely have actually taken to heart some of what we're talking about and have put together a first or a second level report, have taken those 10 pieces of data and have done some report, even if it's sketchy, even if it's 7 people, even if you did it on a piece of paper with a pen and you used an abacus and however you got there, you were counting on your fingers, a simple outcome report based on data you have on one of your programs, on one of your activities for a small group. Just to do it, because it turns out when we do it once, it seems so daunting. It's like taxes. This is a good time to talk about taxes, right? And you're like, oh, I got all the stuff in my box and in the folder, plus I left stuff up, like, you have to set aside a weekend to get all the information, get all the forms, I'm gonna have coffee and donuts, I'm gonna clear the table. It's gonna be all day, it's tax time. You just put it off, you put it off, you put it off. Then you do it, you're like, you know what? It took like an hour and a half, it didn't take so long. The first time you do it, it seems so daunting. The next time you do it, you're like, oh, it wasn't that hard. Then I can do it again, and then I can do it again. You ever notice how when you walk to a place that you've not been to before, like the mall, the park, the zoo, it takes forever. It's like, wow, it's like, it's going to be so long. It's like such a, then you walk back. It seems so long when it's unfamiliar. So I just can't stress enough, like do it one time. Do it one time. Just go take those 10 pieces of information for 20 of your participants in one program, just one thing, and put one together, and then we'll share them. You'll send them ahead of time, and we'll circulate them. We'll talk about how many organizations submitted a report, the number of pages. We'll use our own report of reports. And then share that report somewhere in your agency with some of your staff or some of your colleagues and say, what do you think? Have a conversation. What did we learn? What could we do next time? What would be more interesting? So that's the goal between now and the next convening. All that said, if you don't do any of these reports ever, still come to the next convening. Don't be like, oh no, now I can't come. Didn't do the report. Okay. So we're going to go to our principal presentation, and I want to introduce Amina Fields, who is the Director of Research and Evaluation at the Children's Institute, where I've recently taken a position as the Chief Program Officer. So so this is now both Amina and I are at the Children's Institute, and I worked with Amina when I was at the Children's Institute years ago. When she was beginning to do this work. So a couple of things. She's going to talk about using outcome evaluation with staff as your audience. And she's going to talk about all of the different ways you can use that with your participants, with your staff for quality improvement. The Children's Institute is a fairly large nonprofit, has about 1,000 employees. About a third of its activities are Head Start and Early Head Start. About a third of it is public mental health, so LA County mental health. And about a third of it is DCFS, so Department of Children and Family Services, child welfare focused, family preservation, prevention and aftercare, those kinds of programs, which I know some of the folks in the room and online have the same contracts, do the same programs. And they have resources for a rather large research and evaluation capacity, which Amina will talk about. And they have developed a lot of processes and procedures for both gathering data and reporting data and using data. And as she presents, I mention that because I don't want people to be daunted by the scale. And we've talked about this before. If you're an agency with 3 people and you wear all the hats, and you have nothing but paper and pens, you can't even afford electronic technology, you can do an outcome report. Or if you have no database, you can use Excel. You don't have to have a sophisticated system. And so Amina will talk about it on multiple levels. But the intent is not that you replicate what they're doing, but that you appreciate the culture of inquiry that's been built and the procedures that are needed. And they'll talk about maybe sending forms electronically, but it started off as interdepartment mail, right? That not everything has to be done at every level. It's the activity that needs to be done depending on your resources and your staff. You can automate it or not. You can do more sophisticated things. But really focus on the idea of developing the inquiry of the culture of inquiry, really using data, collecting data in the context of your programs and making use of it in ways that enhance your staff's use of data to inform their own decisions with participants and as a program. So that's really the goal. I'm sure you're going to really appreciate the presentation because Amina's just done a tremendous job, as you will see. So I'm going to shut it off. I'm going to shut it off.
Great. Good morning. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Todd, for the introduction. As he mentioned, I'm also with Children's Institute, and I lead our Research and Evaluation Center. It's a pleasure to talk to you today about how we've created a culture of inquiry. So I'll focus on our CII model. And when I say culture of inquiry, I basically mean how we get data, how we store data, and how we use data. So those practices are what sustain our culture of inquiry at CII. In terms of the agenda, I'm going to start by focusing on how we get data, so linking services and evaluation, talk about our data-informed practice model, program evaluations in progress, And I'll highlight as an example for you our family preservation program. I'll share our logic model and our evaluation plan for family preservation. Then the second part of my presentation, I'm going to focus on how we store data and how we use data. So analyses, reporting, and action. I'll share an assessment protocol for family preservation, talk about our databases. I'll share an example of a client level report, an example of a program level report, and a page from our annual report. And then wrapping up with about 15 minutes for questions at the end. So if you don't mind just holding them until the last 15 minutes, I'm happy to address them. And I also have here with me my colleague O'Brien Enriquez, who's one of our research assistant staff, and he manages the databases for family preservation, partnerships for families, prevention and aftercare, which are in our Strengthening Families cluster of programs. Thank you, O'Brien. Great. So part one, linking services and evaluation. So CII's outcome data utilization story, pretty much our REC origin story. REC is our Research and Evaluation Center, REC, and I'll refer to it as REC. More than 15 years ago, we started with our evaluation, and we've, as Todd mentioned, we've grown considerably in terms of our size and our scope, but there were some key funding events that allowed us to develop the infrastructure to get to where we are today. I do want to point out that we began by hiring one person to serve as our data manager. And that one person created Excel workbooks to store our data, and several of those workbooks we still use today. So one person can start data culture within an agency and then foster that. He's no longer with the agency, but we are most appreciative to his contributions. So let's see if I can highlight here. Oh, it doesn't seem to be working, but if we look at the left side of the timeline, CII became a member of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, NCTSN, in 2001, and we were required to collect core data set information from select clinicians. And so with that, we established protocols to store our data and transfer that data to Duke. That data was in aggregate across the other 20 NCTSN sites. So we didn't use that data internally. We collected it, shared it, and then saw reports in aggregate. We didn't know how our CII clients were doing. We just knew about the core data set. Then in 2011, CII received PEI funding for our clinical clients, and we were required to administer an outcome measure matrix. And with that, we were able to establish protocols for data entry and client level reports for clinicians. So we refined how we were getting our data because we needed to coordinate internally, not just with our research and evaluation center, but also with billing and with clients who were serving, with clinicians who were serving clients in different treatment models that had different outcome measures required for those treatment models. So we refined how we were getting our data, and we also refined how we were storing our data, and then how we were using our data, because we, at that point, created individual client reports that were emailed back to the clinician providing the services. We, at that point, wanted to increase our compliance, and so we started to CC the supervisors. So a clinician has a caseload of about 10 clients, and supervisors have a group of about 4 to 5 clinicians. Right, so clinician and supervisor, at the clinician and supervisor level, we were providing these individual reports for an average of 50 clients per clinician. And they were being used in supervision to guide treatment planning for the clients, as well as with the clients in sessions, the individual reports. After sometime later, we're at 2013 here on the timeline, REC created clinical program level reports, because you have the clinician, supervisor, and then you have the managers. And so it's not useful information to forward a manager 50 plus individual client reports. Managers want to know how are clients doing in a particular program or a particular treatment model. So we would aggregate our data across a particular treatment model, and those program level reports, which Todd talked about, we shared those with our managers. And at that point, we were emailing information back and forth. As our department grew, we were able to establish relationships and hold monthly meetings where we shared our program level reports and quarterly meetings where we shared these reports. Following that, in 2014, our partnership with the Ed McConnell Clark Foundation gave us opportunity to learn how some other agencies were managing their data, not just in the clinical area, but across child welfare programs. And so to launch our data collection across the agency, we held a series of logic model development meetings with various program staff and created evaluation plans. And with that, we established protocols for scoring and graphing data for all of our child welfare program clients. And then most recently in 2016, we created our first annual impact report, which has results across the entire agency, and REC continues to facilitate agency-wide data discussions. So this, again, is our data story, and it did start with one person, one data manager who was storing the data. So where we are today, our Research and Evaluation Center supports the agency to be data informed in treatment planning and program management. So we do that by measuring program impact. We use the data to improve practice through relationships with clinicians, supervisors, managers, and executive management. We prepare reports to funders. We convene our institutional review board, the IRB, which reviews all proposals that we get from partners in the community, partners at various universities who are interested in using our client data to further a research agenda. And then when those projects are selected to be implemented, they're managed, monitored through our Research and Evaluation Center. So this is a list of the services that we provide, all of which have active evaluation plans. So we cluster our services by population at CII. So our behavioral health and wellness services include community mental health, intensive mental health, that's wraparound, full service partnership, FSP, Project ABC, that's an early childhood system of care project, Healthy Moms, Healthy Kids, that's one of our research studies looking at maternal depression. So again, all of that evaluation is coordinated through our Research and Evaluation Center. Our Strengthening Families cluster of services includes partnerships for families, prevention and aftercare, family preservation, CalWorks, and individualized transition skills program. That's for our transition age youth exiting foster care, so it's an individual coaching program. Community Innovations is another cluster of our work. In that area, we have a children exposed to gun violence program in the Watts SPA 6 South LA area. Project Fatherhood, which is in all of the regions that we serve. It's a support group of men in relationships group. National Child Traumatic Stress Network, that's a partnership that I mentioned earlier. We're still a grantee of the NCTSN funding. Our Early Childhood Services cluster includes Head Start and Early Head Start. We have about 20 sites, mostly in the South LA area, as well as the Long Beach and Metro LA area, all of whom we provide support for their program evaluation and student achievement. We have Select Home Visitation Program that's actually, it's in all areas now. It's in Service Area 8, 6, and most recently we expanded to Service Area 4 in Metro LA. And Experiential Learning, that's a research project that we have funded through the Office of Minority Health, where we, it's an after-school program for addressing childhood trauma that we've named Power Up. So these are all of our active evaluation projects. I want to highlight for you today family preservation and share client level reports, share the protocol, share client level reports, share program reports for family preservation. So when the agency decided to manage evaluation for family preservation, the first step was to meet with the program teams and learn about the intended impact of family preservation and the design. So what I have here is a logic model. I apologize, the shading is not the best with the light here, but how many folks are familiar with logic models, either prepared them or, okay? And how many folks have family preservation programs? Okay, great. So the slides will be sent out over email, so you can have another look at the content here. It may be one that you want to share if you are, if you want to just compare the way that we describe our program and the way that your logic models may have developed. So on the far left, we have inputs. It's pretty straightforward: staff, curricula, supplies, equipment, facilities, funding, and community partners. And then we list our outputs. Those are the activities, the things that the staff do. And our outcomes are clustered in 3 areas: short-term outcomes, medium-term outcomes, and long-term outcomes. So what I want to highlight for our conversation is this cluster of outcomes. This doesn't seem to be working, so I'll just point here. So these 3 boxes. So we have support groups, family and individual counseling, and home visitation. Those are 3 services that we offer through our family preservation program. Those 3 services lead to 2 outcomes in the short-term column, right? So the one is engagement and rapport, and the second is understanding trauma and loss. Those 2 short-term outcomes then thread across to medium-term and long-term outcomes. So for engagement and rapport, the medium-term outcome is relationships are developed, and the long-term outcome is strong and trusting bond between staff and clients, increasing clients' support circle. For understanding trauma and loss, as a short-term outcome, the linked medium and long-term outcomes are to increase daily functioning and decrease negative behavior, and improve overall psychosocial functioning of children, parents, and families. So this is a great theory of practice. And this could be printed and stored away in a file cabinet somewhere and not revisited. But that's not what we did at CII. What we did was we linked this logic model to an evaluation plan. So if this is our intended impact, how will we know when we've met those goals? So this is a part 2. And again, this template aligns, our template for the evaluation plan aligns with our logic model. So for our evaluation plan, we clustered the outcomes. So I'll just go back here. So these short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes, we've clustered them into 4 areas: service utilization, social connection, family functioning and parenting, and concrete supports. So as I highlighted before, those two threads on the logic model, I want to highlight for you number 2, social connection, and number 3, family functioning and parenting. So with social connection, the outcomes, the 3 here, are engagement and rapport, relationships developed, strong and trusting bonds, as I just shared. For those outcomes, we then identified indicators. How will we know when we've met those outcomes? Indicators include accepting responsibility, improved relationship with service providers, satisfaction with services, improved communication, trust, and more affection and quality time. Then for those indicators, our Research and Evaluation Center met with our consultants, and we identified measures that could be administered to the families so that we could monitor improvement in those areas. And the measures that we selected are the Protective Factor Survey and the Youth Services Survey for families. So the Protective Factor Survey has a subscale for social emotional support aligned with the outcome for social connection. The Youth Services Survey for families is completed by parents with children 0 to 18, and then by the participant, his or herself, if that person's over age 13. And the Youth Services Survey has items linked to improved communication and satisfaction with services. So we're able to address those indicators with those 2 measures. For family functioning and parenting, again, on the far left, number 3, the outcomes that we were aiming for to understand trauma and loss, to increase daily functioning and decrease negative behavior, and to improve the overall psychosocial functioning of children, parents, and families. So for those 3 outcome areas, the indicators that our team identified are identifying triggers and resolving them, increased coping and resiliency, safer home with reduced violence, use of parenting skills, improved communication, again, trust, increased self-esteem, and school improvement. So for those indicators, they also align with the Protective Factor Survey, and there are three subscales of the Protective Factor Survey that specifically align with those indicators: family functioning, child development, knowledge of parenting, nurturing, and attachment. So again, the protective factor survey as a measure is bridging those two outcome areas. For this particular cluster of indicators, we are also tracking school disciplinary actions. So this as a whole is a description of our family preservation evaluation plan. I just wanted to point out those threads to show you how you can move from a logic model then into an evaluation plan. Once we had agreement on what measures we were going to be using, we then had to determine a method for sharing that information between our program staff and our research and evaluation center. That's in the column to the far right. So administering measures at intake, setting a schedule for follow-up, setting a protocol for data submission, and then expectations for reporting out. So moving to the next, the second section of my presentations. So this is storing data and using data. So this is a visual of our family preservation assessment protocol. Starting on the far left, client enrolls in the family preservation program. The client completes an intake packet with those measures that I just mentioned, the protective factor survey, the youth services survey for families. The family preservation staff then scans the packet to our rec data drop-off email. And as Todd mentioned, with other programs that started many years ago, we were inter-office sending measures via inter-office mail. We now have a system where staff can download and upload measures or send via email. But the process is still, the exchange of information is the same, the method has just advanced. Bless you. Then when REC receives the information, REC does the data entry, so we do the scoring and the graphing of the results, and we generate an intake report that gets sent back to our family preservation staff. REC tracks that client's enrollment in our family preservation program, and we send monthly reminders to family preservation staff when various clients are due for their follow-up. So in this model, it's every 3 months that the family completes our assessment packet. After 3 months, the client completes the follow-up, and then that's again sent to REC. REC does the data entry, generates a follow-up report. At this point, the follow-up report will have both the intake data and the results from follow-up 1. And I'll share an example of that. And then the process continues in the same way. So our family preservation database, which I mentioned is managed by O'Brien, is quite simple. It's in Excel. O'Brien can share a little bit later. We track client enrollment in Excel. We enter and score data in Excel. We've developed templates in Excel to graph those data, and then we email it back to the clinicians. So here, outcome measures submitted to REC. REC does the data entry, stored in Excel by model, and then individual report templates are created in Excel. And additional analyses, when we prepare our aggregate reports, we may do that in SPSS, but oftentimes we could also do that in Excel. And storing our data in Excel workbooks allows us to look across programs that may be using the same measure. So for example, here with family preservation, they're using the protective factor survey. They're also using the protective factor survey with Partnerships for Families and prevention and aftercare. So we can aggregate and show results for all clients across different programs who've received the protection factor survey. So this is program evaluation at a glance. Our REC team has prepared a similar slide for all of our program models. It's just a visual, and it's hard to see, I understand, on this screen, but in the packet you can take a closer look. The data system is at the top, so we have internal tracking, which is done through Excel, and then the family assessment software that's required by DCFS for all subcontractors. The measures are on the next band there, the protective factor survey, which I've talked about, the youth services survey for families, I've also shared a bit about that. The MCPC tracking sheet, that's our multidisciplinary case planning committees. Did I get it right? Okay. Yes. Yes. MCPC tracking sheet internal and external referrals log. Then we pull from the family assessment software utilization of services information and tally of school disciplinary actions. So those are the measures. Some are standardized outcome measures like the protective factor survey and the YSSF. Others are logs where we track particular measure or outcomes. The next band there is data submission. So we have the FAF, the family assessment form, the data drop-off, which is our email system where any staff can send information to rec, or it may go directly to a rec research assistant. And then the timeline band there, we have monthly intake and then every 3 months. So the boxes here represent where that particular measure falls. So for protective factor survey, it's submitted through data drop-off, and the timeline is intake and every 3 months. Similar for the YSSF, and then for the others going across. So let's highlight how we use the protective factors survey. How many folks are familiar with the protective factor survey? Okay. How many people have experience with administering the protective factor survey with their clients? Okay, great. And how many have experience with scoring and graphing the protective factor survey at the individual level or the group level? Yeah? Okay, so I'll show you some examples of how we do that. For those who are not familiar, Okay. And this is provided monthly, this report summary is provided monthly to our program manager, and we also discuss this in meetings. So for family preservation, we have the individual reports, which I shared with the graphs for a particular family. We also have program level reports, which are prepared quarterly and forwarded via email and reviewed with our program managers. The reports are shared to track positive change and areas of improvement, and it provides a visual of progress, not only at the, but at the group level. So as I mentioned, we have the individual client reports, but we're not going to share with the program manager 50 individual client reports. What we do instead is we take all of that data, we aggregate it, we use the same template so that they're familiar with the format, but we highlight different things. So in the individual report, we are highlighting the response scale and the mean score. So that was the 1.8 or 4.4 for each of the areas. With the program level reports, we drop off the response scale, we drop off the mean scores, and really what we're highlighting here is the percent change for all clients who've received family preservation program, family preservation at up. So it's the same template, so they're familiar with, oh, okay, here are the subscales across the bottom, but manager who's interested in improving our family preservation's support services for family functioning, they may look at this report and see, oh, okay, across all clients in our family preservation program, 22%, there was a 22% increase in family functioning. So there was a 22% increase, not 22% increased, just to clarify. So the overall percentage increase was 22%. And then across, you see with knowledge of parenting and child development, that's areas where we have our greatest overall increase. 85% had an increase in helping children learn, and there was a 71% increase in praising the child. And another thing that we do here with our program level reports is we highlight high needs clients. So we look at the subset of clients who expressed difficulty in these areas at intake, and then show their data in action. This isn't anyone who is in our family preservation program. These are specific high needs clients. Oh, okay. Okay, great. So, so I shared individual reports that are for clinicians working with families as well as clinicians in supervision. I shared the program level reports, which are for managers in planning resources for their program, and then we also have agency-wide reports that we share with executive leadership, with funders, with staff kind of across the agency and other program areas. They're prepared annually. They're designed with input from our executive leadership. They incorporate varying types of analyses, and they're disseminated in print and e-copies to our staff, funders, and professional networks. So here's just one page from our impact report. This is the profile page for family preservation. And with this, I want to highlight how we use the protective factor survey here, because it's slightly different than how we were using it before. So at the individual report, we were showing mean scores for that family by subscale and the overall percent change. For the program level report, we were showing the group change. For our annual report, we highlight the percent of families who had any increase in that protective factors area. So it's a different percentage here. So someone may have had a 10 percentage point increase, they're counted as having improved. Someone may have had a 50 percentage point increase, they're also counted as having improved. So for this format, we show here the protective factors, 76% of families have increased family functioning, and resiliency. So it's anyone in the program who had an improvement, not the scale of their improvement, but that 76% of everyone who's in family preservation had an improvement. Is that kind of clear, the way that we can take one measure and show it in 3 different ways? Because the audience is different here. And so we're engaging with funders, we're engaging with volunteers, we're engaging with staff who may not work in the family preservation area. And they also want to know what's the impact of our family preservation program. So this is a simple way to share the results with staff who may not be working primarily in family preservation to kind of understand the nuances of the protective factor scale or the program services. 85% of families have increased social support, 77% of families increased concrete support, 100% of caregivers have an increased ability to help their child learn, and 83% of caregivers have increased knowledge of parenting. The other thing I want to highlight here is that we don't use graphs in this report. So the way that we visualize data in this report is different than the individual reports and the program level reports, right? So we have the icons, so you know the area of service and then the percentage. So it's easier to read if one doesn't have necessarily an evaluation background or a familiarity with that particular tool. We also include here client satisfaction. That's the youth services survey for families. And then information from the FAF regarding family outcomes. So the percent of families who participated in family preservation who met all their case goals for last fiscal year was at 80%. So we highlight that as well. And so I've talked about, I talked about how we started with one data manager, and this is where we are today. So our rec team is advised by 2 consultants, Dr. Baker from UCLA and Bill Monroe from USC. And we have 4 research associates. They're listed in the second tier there, and then 5 research assistants. And so the solid line with the arrows shows our leadership structure in terms of supervision, but the dashed line shows our collaborative structure. And so you can see that across all of our research associate staff, as well as with our research assistants, they're across all of those different program services, the 24 program services that I highlighted earlier in the presentation that all have active evaluation plans. O'Brien is here today. He is our research assistant across several child welfare services. So that's the end of the presentation. There is time. Are we on schedule? Perfect. Okay. So I welcome questions, areas to clarify. We can scroll back through. Your hand went up first, Mr. Cedric. Yeah, yes, please. Oh, for them to hear. Okay. As well? Okay.
I'm just so curious, the CII is so big.
Yes. And
you started with 1 evaluated user net sale. How did you grow and how do you fund research and evaluation?
Yes. So I'll answer there are 2 questions embedded there. How did we grow, and then how do we sustain ourselves, right? So we grew, I'm going to find that slide. Yeah. Do you want me to start with the answer to that one, or start with the other one? Start with this one? Alrighty. So we grew, I mentioned we had 1 data manager who came on board when we got our NCTSN funding. He set up our data storage system so that we could share our core data set information with Duke. Then there were other funding opportunities like PEI that required outcome data to be collected at an individual client level and shared back with DMH. So we started our growth in the clinical area, and we developed infrastructure aligned with the clinical area. We were able to transfer that into other areas like child welfare services once we set up that infrastructure. So it's sort of how we grew as an infrastructure and as a team. Our original data manager, when we were doing data entry and client level reports, there were a few part-time graduate student staff who worked in the evenings because we were storing data and we were getting what we got, but we weren't in relationship with programs. So we didn't need to be there during the day to foster the sharing of data. And the use of data was just back to the clinician. So there wasn't the full sort of circle when we first started. That team grew from part-time staff to full-time staff, and then the relationships with programs grew. So our Research and Evaluation Center really grew as our agency made it more of a priority to be data informed and to link our services with evaluation. Does that sufficiently answer the first part of the question? Okay, so how do we sustain ourselves? So we sustain ourselves by embedding evaluation as a function across all of our programs. So when our grants and development department seeks out new contracts, we identify a portion of the funding to evaluation. And most of our staff are patched together with allocations from various contracts and then and support programs accordingly. There are a few larger funding contracts that we have that allow for one full-time employee, but most of them sort of cross between county contracts, federal contracts, private foundation dollars, and donor dollars. So those are our 4 main areas. Yes. Sure.
We have a question from Gwendolyn from Atascadero. She was asking when you were showing the data, she just wanted clarification if you were showing the clients the aggregated information or if you were sharing the information with the staff.
Yes, yes, and yes. So as Todd was saying before, the data are useful when you go, the example was when you go to get your blood pressure, right? The doctor doesn't hold that information for himself. It's shared back with you as the patient. And so we do have the individual client reports are shared by the clinician or the service provider, if it's a non-clinical practice model, by the service provider with the family. The individual reports are also shared between the service provider and his or her supervisor, so that we can monitor our service delivery, our service quality. And the last bit?
She just wanted to know if you share the staff and the clients or just the clients? Or just
Yeah, so both and. Different reports. The client only sees the individual client report. Staff review and discuss the individual client report during supervision, ideally, as well as the program level reports during program planning meetings. So there was another question here. Oh, okay. Even if they're using the mic? Okay, we'll do.
For your individual client report, the protective factor survey, do you use a scoring software for that, or?
So we have a calculator. Well, O'Brien, do you want to answer that one? Oh, he's got it on mic. Okay, so the question was, for our individual reports, do we use a scoring software? No. We built our calculators in Excel. And so for those of you who are less familiar with the protective factor survey, there's the raw data, so the actual response that the client indicates on the form. Raw data needs to be scored because some of the items are reversed, right? So they're not always in one order. So we have calculators where we enter the raw data into Excel, and then we have calculators where we score the data, and so then we have the results. And we have those for Spanish, and we use the protective factor survey both in English and in Spanish. With family preservation, we use a version that is the English version with Spanish translation, but per the survey developers, there's actually a separate version that is Spanish and a version that is English, and the Spanish version should be scored differently. Did I answer that correctly?
The reason why I ask is because our agency, we do have a research and eval team, but so for example, I'm thinking about the P&A funding that we have and how we could start looking at some of the data that we collect for some of our activities.
Mm-hmm.
But the P&A funding is not enough to fund our, the work for our R&E team. So if, let's say, the coordinator were to start doing a small data collection and analysis, then we'll have to score the protective factor surveys ourselves. I think the original model has a scoring database, but under PNA, the PNA network has already changed
The version.
protective factor
Yes,
survey,
correct.
so we cannot use
Yes.
the database anymore. So then I guess it'll be manually scored.
So Karen, that's a really great question and a great thing to bring into the conversation. So the protective factor survey was developed by Friends. It's been modified by various funders who require it as part of the service delivery. So there is a version that is the PNA, prevention and aftercare version, and there is a version that is our family preservation version, and there's slight differences. The tools developed by the Friends group is aligned with their original version. And so creating the workbooks in Excel gives us the flexibility to modify and enter data across all of those different versions. And so my advice to you with PNA and where to get started would be to consider building that template in Excel. Great. Is that any other questions? Do we have a couple more minutes for questions? Is there another question? Oh, sure.
So two things. Would you talk about how the individual reports are generated in the Excel template?
Mm-hmm.
And would you talk about your meetings with the teams?
Okay.
And what you discuss in those meetings and the conversation?
Perfect. So the data entry is managed by research assistants and our research associates, and the report templates are set up to be are set up in Excel. And so I'm going to pass it to O'Brien to describe that process. He manages our family preservation data.
Yeah, so pretty much everything is done in Excel. So that one of the slides that we had up for the individual client report, that was actually done through Excel. So I was saying that everything that we do is pretty much through Excel for data collection. And so that client report that we saw earlier in the slides, that was actually done through Excel as well. So we set up a sort of template to kind of basically pull a client data and graph it all for us. And this is all software that's, again, it's just on Excel. Like it's I don't know if you guys have seen like the smart charts or the bar graphs. That's one of the things that it's actually utilizing. So it's pretty easy to kind of set up. It doesn't really require any like advanced software for that. And then also for the aggregate reports as well. So it's a very similar thing, except this is where we get more into using like pivot tables and again, everything that's on Excel, nothing that you have to download or kind of like buy or anything like that. And using that, it kind of makes it a lot easier for us to streamline gathering that data and just kind of really presenting it in an aggregate report. So yeah, I hope that answered the question.
Yeah. So that was part one of your question, and then the meetings, yes. So one of my main tasks is maintaining relationship between our Research and Evaluation Center and our program teams. And as Todd shared, we're a fairly large agency, and we have service sites across LA County. And so we established a practice of meeting monthly with the VPs and the clinical program managers for each of the various population areas. And sometimes those happen regionally, and sometimes they happen across regions, but they do happen once a month. And I attend those meetings, prepare agendas for those meetings, and we go over progress fiscal year to date. And we review the data, they ask questions, we troubleshoot areas with either getting the data, storing the data, or using the data at the group. And a lot of those relationships developed when we were doing the logic model process, and we've sustained them. So I don't know if does that answer your question, Todd, about meetings? Are there any other online questions? Oh, yeah, oh.
Thank you. This has been very helpful to me personally because the 5 protective factors survey is what we're going to start doing in our county, and we're getting prepared to work on that. But my question is, just for the audience back in my community, can you just please share a little bit about your education background, and O'Brien, you too, because in our community we think we have to have PhDs to do this work. And I just would like you to just share a little bit about your educational background and how to use that.
Sure. So great question, and one does not. I think there needs to be an interest across the agency in being data informed and as I mentioned, collecting, storing, and using data. The actual skills, the technical skills, can be taught. And I enjoy teaching them. We have a team of researchers and research associate staff, most of whom are recent undergraduates from various institutions here in California, and they are most of them were psychology majors undergrad and worked in research labs. And I think recent graduates are a great resource because they're interested in moving from a university setting into a community setting. And so the data are much more messy when you're working in community settings, and sometimes we have to go fetch it, and sometimes we have an online system, but sometimes it still comes in a packet. Sometimes it comes in when we see a clinician in the hall and they're like, oh, I have some packets for you. And so I think we have a young team that is flexible and excited to learn and excited to share. And I think that's what's key, more so than a particular degree to be able to do the work, because it can all be taught utilizing Excel. All the templates are set. Doing the data entry, it takes about 3 or 4 months for us to onboard. And most of our team, they're coming to us with an interest in research and evaluation, and the average tenure is about 3 years before they go on to graduate school. So my background, I worked in education originally. So research and evaluation in the mental health field is much newer than research and evaluation in the education field. We've been assessing kids for probably about as long as we've been teaching kids. And so that was my background before coming to CII. I worked for an education research agency called WestEd, based in San Francisco, and have always been interested in evaluation. Working in the mental health field is new. I've been with CII since 2011, and my role within the agency has grown with the agency. And so there wasn't much evaluation happening when I joined, and now there's much more, and happy to be a part of it. I don't know, Brian, if you want to share anything else?
Yeah, so she covered my end of it as well, that I graduated about 3 years ago from the University of California, Riverside, where I got my bachelor's in psychology. And then from there, I actually used to work with families with kiddos with autism, so behavioral services, which I did for about 2 years before. So that was data driven as well. There was a lot of data collection in ABA, and so that kind of sparked that interest into kind of pursuing more the research aspect of all that, and found myself in CII. So yeah.
Great. Does that answer your question? Yeah, great. Thank you.
So we just sort of summarize a couple of things. I want to thank Amina and O'Brien, for the presentation. And they'll be around to answer questions that we might have individually. Just wanted to draw attention to a couple of things. One about the funding. So all of us have contracts for services. We have family preservation contracts, prevention and aftercare contracts, CAPIT contracts, what have you. The PEI, that's the prevention and early intervention contracts. And we use those contracts to fund programs. We hire staff. We also hire receptionists. We hire assistants. We pay for supervisors. We pay for managers. We pay for buildings. We pay for paper. We pay for cell phones and mileage. And if you intentional, you'll pay for part of an evaluator. Where does it get funded? It gets funded with everything else we fund. The question, I guess, is why do we talk about outcomes but never fund anyone to do outcomes? But we manage to fund everything else. So all I'm saying is it's a choice. It's a choice, right? You get to fund the staff person or the supervisor or the manager or the building, you fund phones or whatever you fund to make. If you think that outcomes are critical, you'll fund outcomes. If we're not funding outcomes, then I guess it's because we haven't quite decided that it falls on the side of the ledger that deserves money, right? So I mean, I know it sounds funny, and some of our contracts are big and some are small. Not every contract affords a full-time person, but not every contract needs a full-time person, a piece of a person, right? Easier to fund a piece of a person who works someplace else and wants to work in the evening, right? There you go. And you can build it up that way. A graduate student, a person who's putting themselves through college, somebody who wants to help with your evaluation. So I just want to draw attention to that. I know it's funny, but it's funded like everything. So, and then I want to draw attention to the nature of the reports. I know this was really clear. The reports to use, aggregate, and that you can use with funders. And I think Tina did a great job of highlighting how those reports work, how they build on each other. It's the same, and I hope you noticed that it's the same set of data. Bricks, like Legos, and the individual Legos are used. When you put the Legos together, then you have a plane or a rocket ship or whatever you're build with Legos. You know, and then if you want to build something else with the same Legos, you can. So something for a funder, something for a program, something for an individual consumer, a client. So I just wanted to illustrate the very same data. I also want to draw attention, and Amina went through this, but you might not have caught it exactly. Some of the data is at CII. They collect them, and some of it comes from FAF. That data our family preservation staff and enter into DCFS's database. It's not our database. They make us enter it into their database so that they can track it. We extract that data out of the database. So the rec team is pulling data they collect themselves plus data that they've entered into that database. Just like we all enter information for FIVE, for mental health, for all these different agencies. It's available for us to use too, right? And they don't enter it twice. They enter it, staff enter it in, rec pulls it out and uses that. So I just wanted to draw attention that the data doesn't always have to be your own data. And I wanted to point out was the dialogue. They're talking about data. It used to just be staff talking with, getting the reports and then it's the monthly meetings where they're talking about the data. What does the data show? And CII, all the programs had evaluation originally. Only some did, because those were the ones that were required. And actually, this happened just a few months ago. They put out their annual report, and there's and they have a threshold, 20, 30. If you don't have data on 30 clients, you don't get in the report because it's too small for us to feel like it's credible. So there was a report, out came the annual impact report, and our staff are reading the report. Oh, look at this, and oh, look at that. Oh, that's my program, And then but where's our program? And they didn't have enough data to make the report. So the manager of that program came to the rec team and they were like, how come our program doesn't get in the report? And they're like, well, we didn't get it. She says, well, you're going to come meet with us. We're going to make the report next year. When you have a culture of inquiry, everyone wants in, right? When you're starting in the beginning, people are like, collecting data? I don't want to collect data. Why are you making me collect data? This is extra work. How can I do it? I can't possibly. I have to see clients. I have to do the real work, not the data collecting work. But once you've created a culture, then no one wants to be left out. Why do they get to be featured? Why do you get to show their outcomes? Why aren't you showing our outcomes? And then it's because, well, you didn't give us enough data to show your outcomes. Oh, well, then what do we need to do to have enough data? And there you go. Then you have that participation. And that's where you want to go. You want to go from data being the thing that you're required to do to data being the thing that you get to do if you work hard enough, right? So it's the thing you're competing to be as opposed to the thing you're required to do, right? So that people are using data. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of those things. We're entering into our break now. So for people online and for people in remote, you guys are on break, we're on break, and we come back in. We'll reconvene at 11:30.
Todd is not coming back. Is he going to introduce the core evaluation, or should I do that?
What happened?
Well, it's 11:30. We're supposed to start the activity. So he's out there and I'm just going to start the process. Okay, thank you. So we're going to bring everybody back together for the rest of our day. We have a very special activity to do. So I see Todd is out there handling some very important tasks. So I'm just going to keep us on time. And this is the part of our day. We wanted you to have an opportunity to do an activity, and the core evaluation tool, which is in your packet, okay? We'd like you to pull that out, please. And our online audience and our remote audience all have the same sheet. And what we want you to do is be in a group. So you two are kind of a group, or do you want to join a group? Or you know, Brian, you're such a topic expert. It'd be great to have you be part of this. Yeah, come over, go over there. And so we're going to just let you dive in. Now, folks that are back in the remote sites, there's remote hosts are going to help facilitate the conversation. Those of you who are online from your own office, please just use this as a guide to think about what you have learned today, and let this prompt your thinking. And so you're going to have about 20 minutes. Then we're going to call you back, and we're going to hear from what your findings were. So our online audience will be sharing what they came up with, our remote sites, and of course, you folks here. So, ready? Pardon? 10 minutes to do the exercise. Yeah, 10 minutes. Oh, it's just 10 minutes? I thought it was 20 minutes. 10 minutes to complete the sheet, then move it to the dialogue. Thank you. Good thing I have Natalie here because she keeps me on task. So it's 10 minutes. You have 10 minutes to do this, and then we're going to report out. Okay? Thank you. Mm-hmm. Okay, let me just call everybody back together for just a moment. And as you're working on your worksheet, this is your opportunity now to ask these questions for the next 10 minutes amongst yourselves. And those who are back at the online audience, doing the same practice with these sets of questions. So use these to prompt your next 10 minutes of discussion, okay? Go.
For those of you online, please feel free to share your answers in the chat box. You can share all or just one or two of the answers for some of the questions. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to pull everybody in for just a second and ask you to prepare your questions for the presenters that are here today. This is a really great opportunity. You have some good expertise with you. I know that some of us have gone and had conversations with Amina, and we want to bring them up and answer your questions about what you discovered in your activity and just any other thoughts you might have. So 5 more minutes. And then we're going to bring them in and we'll go from there. Okay? Thanks.
Hi, at Remote Sites. We'd like to check in with you, so please check your messages.
Okay, we're going to start our process to have O'Brien and Amina come up, and Todd will be with us when he can. All right, so here is your opportunity, but we're not starting with this group first. We're going to start with our online audience first, okay? And what will happen is we'll reach out over here, and I need to come back here, or no? Are you good? Okay, all right. So can we check in with San Bernardino?
Actually, we have a participant, Liz Herrera,
Okay.
who said, we contract with an outside evaluator to evaluate our progress in increasing protective factors in all of our programs. This has been very helpful. The challenge has been communication and coordination of data sharing with staff because we don't have someone within the agency who has the time to oversee this effort. We are very lean administratively.
Thank you, Liz. That's, I think that's maybe a common challenge among agencies, kind of being very lean and contracting out to an external group to manage one's evaluation progress. As Todd was saying before, at CII, having a research and evaluation center is like having a receptionist. Like that's our approach. You want someone to greet families when they come in the building, and you want a team to provide evaluation support to our direct service staff. And that's our approach. And our research and evaluation center is part of administration, so we don't sit in a particular project area. We sit with IT, with finance. So the way that we sort of our agency is structured, that's how our research and evaluation is designed. In terms of partnering with external agencies, I can understand the benefit in doing that. I think the drawback is that they may be unable to provide the individual client reports that sustain the ongoing evaluation, so maybe unable to provide the relationship building that happen between the evaluation team and the program staff to keep the information sharing going and relevant. So I don't know if that answers the question or if that was just more of a statement, a comment, right? But I think it's a common challenge, and yeah.
Now we are going to have our remote site, San Diego, will report next. So we will unmute them. Hello, San Diego.
Hi. So we talked a bit about what the barriers are to sharing data within our organizations. We talked a bit about finding a balance between not over-presenting and not over-collecting, but finding the best way to share information so it's still a learning experience for our staff, making sure though it's not a liability. So we had some very interesting discussions as a group. We all agreed that the core evaluation tool was very thought-provoking. We appreciated going through it. And we did have a question for the presenters. We're curious if they recommend a certain way of administering or using this tool in an organization, perhaps completed individually, anonymously, as a large group with all members of the organization, or if they have any thoughts around utilizing the tool.
Thank you, San Diego.
So the question is about the tool you guys have been using. Yeah. So this tool is new to us, actually. We're recently involved in a project with Department of Mental Health, and they introduced this tool to us. I think though so you could use this tool or you could use a modified version of the tool. I think it speaks to the larger conversation about dialogue around use of data and starting somewhere, whether you use the tool, which is handy because, I don't know, because it's a tool and because you think about the questions, you answer the questions. And sometimes that's what people it's helpful. If you're learning to cook, a recipe is a good thing but if you're really good and then you want to improvise, you don't use the recipe, you're like, oh, it's my grandmother's recipe, it's memorized, it's so much this, it's so much that. So I think that utility is that it starts off guiding the conversation. The larger issue, though, is having the conversation, talking about data and talking about how to use data, but keeping in mind that use of data has audience and decision in mind. Data is about informing decisions. Why do I want to know if it's going to rain? Right? Oh, is it going to? I say to my wife, is it going to rain today? That's so I can decide if I should bring an umbrella, right? We use data to inform decisions. So if you're going to talk about data, the question is for what purpose? How is this data? What decisions are we making? What decisions am I making as a practitioner, a supervisor, a manager, a CEO, a policymaker, a funder? What decisions am I making? What information do I need to make an informed decision? That's really, right? That's the question. And so then that helps you to know what information. And the point is having that conversation. We actually use decisions information all the time to inform our decisions. But it's almost invisible to us, right? You can't be in the world without make decisions. And something's informing those decisions. Life experience, what your mother told you to do, what you learned in college, I don't know. But it's invisible to us. It happens automatically. But in this context, we're making it deliberate. We're gathering information to form our decisions rather than relying on this sort of intuitive process. That's outcome evaluation, right? I don't know if that answered it at all.
Thank you.
Great.
Oh, there you are, right there.
Now we have.
I'm talking here and can't see you. You're talking there and can't see me.
Now we're going to move to, let's see here. Sorry. We have an online question from Jennifer Kuo, and she wants tips for collecting data on military and veteran families. Not all families are identifying on forms, or staff know how to identify and ask the right questions. So any tips you can share? So tips for collecting data on military and veteran families, since not all families are identifying on forms, or staff may not know how to identify or ask the right questions.
So I'm not 100% sure I'm following the question. The question is in reference to military families, and the part I'm missing is the forms, like because they don't know who's a military family and they want to find out if a person's in the military. So I guess the question is if in some respects, I guess it's straightforward. I'll see if Amina has another thought. But if there may be things that we want to talk about that aren't required, in which case then we have to figure out how to add them to our forms, right? So if we care about military families and it's nothing we ask, then as part of our enrollment information, we would include a question that says, yeah, is it that? She's clarifying.
Intake forms and referral forms.
And you want to know if a person's military, or you want to know how to talk with a person?
I think they want to know how to identify if a person is a military.
I think it's as straightforward as adding a question on the intake form where you ask the person, do you have a background being in the military? But to a larger point, anything that's important needs to be asked about. If you think it's important to know if a person has a veteran status, then you ask if they're a veteran. If you want to know if a person is LGBT, then you're going to have to ask about whether they identify that way. And sometimes we're hesitant to ask questions because we think that it will make people uncomfortable. But if it's an important issue, thank you, Cedric is saying it, then you have to ask the question, and it's just a matter of doing it in a respectful way. If people understand why you're asking it, and you do it in a respectful way, they don't have a problem. I think if it shows up on a form, if I'm filling out a credit application and it asks me if I'm LGBT, I'm probably going to think, why do you care? How does that affect my credit? I'm not going to answer the question. But if I'm in the context of having a conversation with somebody and they're explaining the reason they asked for the information, then I may be comfortable talking about it. The other thing I think that's important is that the importance of relationship when it comes to collecting information. People don't like to talk about themselves with people who don't know care about them. And so the stronger your relationship with someone, the more you can ask personal information. But this is not new to service providers. This is probably true for you and your own relationships, right? Like you don't go and meet someone for the first time and tell them your childhood, life. You say things like, the weather and what you do at work. And I mean, write it. And then they tell you something and then you meet them a second time, right? You build a relationship. So that's the same thing. Don't expect you can ask personal questions the first time a person seeks services. And most of us do our intakes over a period of time, more than one conversation in one occasion. So that might be part of the issue.
All right, and now we're going to have our Atascadero site report out.
Hi, so this is Glenn. I'm going to report for our conversation that we had. And to start out with what kind of data do you want to share with staff? So we had the conversation that sometimes with staff, it's important to just share overall general data, because one of the barriers was if it's too specific, some staff members get into a competition with one another. Also, for some other programs that we work with, is sharing the outcomes with staff and individual school information, like how many referrals and things like that, were important to share with the staff as well. Another barrier that we talked about was the time and common language for staff to understand. So the time it takes to share the data in a way that everyone can understand. And that ties into the financials. Sometimes there's a financial barrier there, and that we don't have enough support to be able to share the information as we would like to. And then we talked about what are we prepared to start doing next week to engage staff in the evaluation process. And this is going to be an ongoing conversation, but starting with info going out to staff either on a monthly or quarterly basis, and feedback at staff meetings, having a really informal conversation with staff about what's going well, what's not, and building that into the evaluation process. And then helping staff change their thinking and buy into the process of data collection is really, really vital and important. Because if they buy into the process of why we're collecting this data, it helps them understand, okay, it is important for me to get my data correct, because it'll help our funding eventually and secure my position that I'm doing now.
I want to just mention two things that you guys were reporting out on. One is about the notion of competition. So when you start sharing data, the agency has to do it in the, well, one would be prudent to do it in the, whether you have to, I don't know, in the context of we can make mistakes. In other words, the data, don't go in thinking the data should always be great. Because if you're not open to knowing that not everything you're doing is working, then, and people feel like there are adverse consequences, then you have a culture of inquiry. You're going to have a culture of fear, maybe, or you'll have a culture of testing to the test, so to speak, teaching to the test, so that people are just going to highlight what's working and are going to try to keep what's not working from not being talked about. So yet we have to understand that you don't get good outcomes without making mistakes, and there's no improvement if everything is working well. The assumption is there's always room for improvement, which means something isn't working as well as it could be, right? So a culture of inquiry is a culture of understanding that mistakes aren't to be avoided, they're to be learned from. But if we're not open to hearing there's room to learn, you're not going to really have a culture of inquiry. So there has to be sort of a permissiveness about that. The second comment I wanted to say from your comments is, even when your data's sketchy and incomplete, report it. Because if you wait for the data to be 100% good, you never get there. So I've seen projects where people are looking to have a threshold of completeness before they'll report anything. I will tell you, you won't report anything, right? So like, if you're going to start and, your goal is to run a marathon, you don't wait till you're fit enough to run the marathon. The first time out the door is not going to be 26 miles. The first time out the door is going to be around the block, and then you're winded and you can't get air. Your muscles hurt. You're like, I'm not. You don't, right? Then you stop. You don't injure yourself, and it's a mile, and then it's 2 miles. You work your way up to the marathon. So don't wait for the data to be perfect. Put the incomplete data out there. And then people are, what is this? This isn't right. And you'll say, I know, because we're missing a bunch of data. Oh, I'm going to get you the data. I'm going to get you the data. Then it's going to be good. But if you never put it out there, there isn't any motivation to do it. So do not wait. I mean, we've been saying this from the first convening. Pick a program, pick a number of clients, pull their data into an Excel spreadsheet and make your first report. 1 page, 4 tables, something simple, and put it out in hands. Don't wait to have everything good.
I hope it's working because I know my voice doesn't carry well. So my question around some of this is, I'm not the data person at our agency, first of all, so I'll make that disclaimer. I wish we did have priority and funding for it required. At the same time, I think all of this is great, but it kind of, my question goes to what you were mentioning about it's okay to make mistakes. I'm not here to talk about my degree, but having written a dissertation, it was helpful to have a dissertation committee that had me write in reflexivity and my partial research on traditional healers and Jungian depth psychology. But what I see in programming is people get committed and compassionate drum dance, and then they don't admit their own unconscious and conscious biases toward that and leave out reflexivity.
Can you hear this?
So can't there at least be a statement in all this, just one line, that there is some partiality to your own
So repeat the question. Okay. Yeah, no, I appreciate the question about being reflective in not just our practice of service survey, but in our practice of evaluation. And I hear about a statement, like a disclaimer, that may be included, that we are biased to our own activities and programs. I appreciate the question. I think to address that, we use data evaluation techniques that are not just the service provider giving feedback on the outcomes of the intervention, but we ask the service participants to complete outcome measures. So the protective factor survey is an account from the family member, the primary caregiver, on the effects of the intervention on improving family functioning, parenting knowledge, and resiliency. So I appreciate the question. I think in how we present the data, certainly there are biases, and one can be inclined to only show the positive data. But if you recall the slide that I included, which had the individual report, there were two subscales for intake that were at 0. And that's because there was insufficient data either by the person administering the measure or the caregiver chose not to respond. And we include that in our individual report. That's at intake. And then you can see at follow-up, there is a response from the family, and we can then kind of assess the functioning at that point. So we try to be transparent in how we show data that are missing and data that are collected within each program. I don't know if that gets at your question about bias. Oh, when there's a matrix of activities, what's the secret? The secret sauce.
So I think your logic model, at least at our table, was helpful. That it seemed like you were pulling out one protective factor or something. And I don't have all the answers on that. I just think the dialogue is good. I don't know how our agency will use it, but all of this does seem like it's a broader question for California even to be able to sustain funding to have all of this conversation too.
So, and I just want to add two comments. So one is, I think the outcome data is the data. And sometimes it comes from participants, sometimes it comes from staff, sometimes it comes from a third party. I think how we use the data is sometimes where transparency is lost. Sometimes we want to highlight only the good outcomes. We want to not share the negative outcomes. And that really speaks to the culture your agency has. If you're open, you look at all the data, the good, the bad, and the ugly, as they say, if you're a Western fan, I guess. Then you're open to the whole thing. And so I don't really think the issue is so much collecting data or using data, it's the way we choose to report the data and whether we're reporting it openly. But then I could say that about ourselves too, right? Sometimes, when we're reflective and we think to ourselves about our own behavior, our own interactions in various relationships we have with folks, or when we want to just imagine that it's always the other person and that we have no role. So we all can stand to be reflective, whether it's in our personal relationships or in our evaluation of our agency's work. Ideally, we're open to what the data has to say. What I've seen often is we get bad results and people want to right away explain it away. Oh, that dropped, that's because they were the participant wasn't honest when they filled the baseline data out, but now they're being honest. And that's why we see a drop. That we always have a reason to explain away the negative and to take credit for the positive. This is a little bit maybe human nature, because who doesn't want to take credit for what's working and distance ourselves from what's not? But I think that a culture of inquiry is to try to look at the information and see if it tells us something important, because ultimately we want better outcomes for people, and the information can help us do that if we're open. So to your point, being reflective about the data and not right away assuming a negative outcome necessarily is a mistake. It may actually be relevant. Yes, but I want to say maybe it's not about the program being cut. Maybe it's about the program being changed. Right? So we moved from one practice to another kind of practice. This is the whole movement around evidence-based practices, right? So prevention and early intervention in LA County, which requires evidence-based practices, they didn't cut money. They kept money. They adjusted practice. So if we live in a world where we think that every time we don't get a good outcome, we lose funding, that's unfortunate. I think the issue is if we have an outcome that's not favorable, then the implication is change your practice. And if you have data, then that can help you. For example, look at your clients who had your best outcome and see what you did with them, and then see if you can do that across the board. So I was talking about recipes. I don't know if you are an experimental chef. I am not, but I imagine I am. And if I was, I might try 3 or 4 different recipes and then have my family taste them. And then the ones that are terrible, I won't repeat. And the ones that people like, I'll think to myself, what did I do with this one, right? And do more of that. So hopefully we're not punitive every time we reflect on our true impact, but we're using that information to improve our practice. So we've been talking a lot about the child welfare system, which at times doesn't achieve the outcomes that we want. That doesn't mean we're going to stop funding child welfare. It means we're going to try to get smarter about how we deliver services to kids in the child welfare system.
So we actually, okay, we have our Lancaster site who'd like to report out, so I will unmute you. So go ahead, Victor. You have to unmute yourself.
Do you have to enter their PIN because they're on the phone?
Oh, if you're on the phone, you have to enter your PIN.
Just tell them to write it.
So while they're doing that, maybe we can just go back to something else.
So while we're waiting for Lancaster to unmute themselves, is there another question from the audience here? All right. Oh, yes. How do we do this?
Okay. Hi, my name is Carlos Hernandez from Spirit Family Services. This question is more directed to Brian O'Brien. Is there any way you could email all of us some sample templates you have in place on how you started, how it progressed, how it grew? Just because I get the sense this data management field is still growing, and we may come across separate factors that we may have to include later on. So if we can have like access to some simple templates, especially the ones with the protective factors that have already formulas in place, so we can measure the growth.
Great question, Carlos. Thank you. So the templates that we've developed internally at CII, we continue to refine, and we've refined over 10 years. So they're property of CII, but would be happy to provide TA assistance for you or your agency if you wish to email us directly. But we don't disseminate those broadly for a number of reasons. One, they are property of CII, but then the other thing, when you're working in Excel, you have the formulas that are in the rows. It's very easy to add a row and not extend the formula, and then sort of get a wrong result when you're then kind of trying to do some summary. So our Excel, we call them databases, actually just a series of Excel workbooks that are linked together. So it's something that we've built and that we maintain, and we'll be happy to contact individual agencies, and I provide consultation, and it's an area that we would consider growing, but we don't distribute them broadly. So, but I appreciate the question and the opportunity to work together.
Well, we're excited that I heard the word consultation and you're open to that. So that's very, very cool. Thank you. So are we ready to hear from Lancaster? Okay. All right. Is there another question from the room here right now? Okay, that's fine. We'd love to hear from you. We're going to race across the room here and get you connected.
Well, I like the culture of inquiry, but, you know, speaking to culture, and what, I forget your name, what you were saying about not going on, like, the purpose of all of this is to have data that's realistic, not going on our hunches. So in American Indian, Alaska Native, they've done reports with LA County for community-based evidence, and I think Karen was speaking to that too with their agency. So once all this happens, is that community-based evidence, is the purpose of this then to make it evidence-based, or this stays under promising practices, or can you speak to that?
So your question has to do with, can you use your own outcome evaluation as a foundation for supporting the evidence-basedness of your practice, which might not have been a national model. And in Los Angeles County, they go out of their way in their prevention and early intervention models to talk about evidence-based practice and also community community defined practice. And so, which may or may not have quite the same relevance to some of the other sites, but does have relevance in LA. And yes, LA County has actually adopted practices under prevention and early intervention based on the weight of evidence that agencies themselves have collected. And I can think of 2 or 3 that started that way. But in a more general sense, all of our evidence-based practices started that way. So pick any evidence-based practice you want, parent-child interaction therapy or incredible years or trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy that are commonly used, started with a person who was a clinician researcher typically, who thought that what they were doing worked and who began to collect outcome evaluation data. And then when they thought that data was promising, then they justified spending more money to do a more rigorous study until they were able to approach somebody like NIMH to do a random clinical trial, which is the really rigorous research, and ultimately substantiated as an evidence-based practice. They didn't start that way. No one started funding an idea with an NIMH grant and control groups. They all started with somebody who was steeped in the work, who thought they had an understanding of what made the difference in somebody's life, that they thought other people had overlooked, an innovation, and they evaluated it. But I think the larger issue is we all are providing services, and in that context, we're collecting information on everyone we serve, on every service we provide. We have all kinds of information we collect that we very rarely use. And so again, I know this is going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but pick a handful of your data. Start with the 10 data elements that are from the early part of today's presentation. Do your first report. Build out your capacity to use data. And it grows. I know I used the marathon example, but it really, I don't know if anyone has run before or played tennis or any athletic endeavor. It always starts slow and hard. And then the more you do it, the more your body gets comfortable doing it, the more you do it. And that is the same thing with data. Once you have that, you can do all kinds of things. You can use it with funders. You could use it internally. It can drive quality improvement. You can decide to call it a practice and substantiate it as evidence-based. You can do many, many things. I don't know that any one of those should be your first goal. I think your first goal would be to, yes, thank you. It's the Nike, right? Just do it. Your first goal should be put an outcome report into the world. Ugly, piecemeal, missing data, telling you almost nothing of interest and nothing you don't already know. Just put it out in the world so that you have done that. And then it will drive you to do a better job. You'll get hooked on it, and then you'll want to do more and more. And then the people in your agency, the managers, the executives, they'll say, wow, this is interesting. And you'd be like, I could improve it if I had a little bit more dedicated staff. And then they'll want to fund it, right? And that's how you put it out there. It's if you build it, they will come. You don't build it, no one knows you need it. What should I fund? What would you do with the funding? Put it out there first, and then they'll want to fund more of it. So I can't say it strongly enough. Small, ugly, incomplete. That's my motto. Just put it out there, something out there in the world, and then begin to develop that capacity.
Okay. All right. We have another question here, and this will be the final one unless we have something from the online group. Okay, this will be the last one.
Hi. Is there a particular website that you would suggest for us to be able to go through and identify various like surveys, forms, measurement outcomes, tools?
We saw some head nodding. We saw some head nodding.
clearinghouse?
Yeah. Great question. There are several clearinghouses that we use to access outcome measures. We're always doing outcome measure research as programming emphases shift. And so there's the evidence-based evaluation clearinghouse, which I'm not sure the web address.
That's
But
the Rady Center, funded by the Department of Social Services. Oh. The Rady Center in San Diego, funded Rady, R-A-D-Y, but that's not how you're going to find it. That's who hosts it. And it's funded by the State Department of Social Services. It's the Child Welfare Evidence-Based Practices Clearinghouse, CEBC. So if you put CEBC into a Google search, it will almost always be your first link.
And another resource that we use is through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, so that's nctsn.org. And through that website, there is a full database where you can search not only outcome measures, but evidence-based practice models. And the developer information's on there. Any research articles would be linked through there as well. And so nctsn.org, that's the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. It's an open site, and many of the measures are public or free, so you can access and download them.
So I said that was the last question, and I meant it. We're going to wrap it up right now because what's most important is that we recognize and thank our guests that were here today, our presenters. So let's give them a round of applause. And thank you very much, O'Brien and Amina and Todd, for being part of this learning. I could see there was a lot of engaged conversation today, and I know I can speak personally for myself. I have come away with improved knowledge on how I'm carrying it back to the folks that I work with in San Luis Obispo County in the Family Resource Center sector. So, evaluations, thank you. I see some people working on them a little bit, and we really appreciate that you do them. And finally, I want to say on May 17th, put that in your calendar because this will be the number 4 of this series of data education and systems understanding. We're just going to spend the day. We're not sure if it's going to be a full day or a half day. We're still debating on that. Our location is yet to be determined. It'll be obviously in the Southern California region. Hopefully by then we'll have some of our technical issues improved upon. So you're always welcome to be with us online. So on that day, we're definitely going to take some time and not just do an overview of what we learned, like Todd introduced to you here today when you did the first convening and the second, but we're going to expand upon it. And please let us know in the evaluations if you feel like this is something we want to expand into the second year, because we would like to hear from you about that work. So again, to the strategies team behind the cameras, thank you, Natalie, and thank you to all of you for taking the time to be with us today. You're welcome.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll just leave them there. So for those of you in the room, I have not been able to